From racing a car off a pier and landing straight into a conveniently placed yacht, to a street fight that doesn't involve guns or knives but wrenches. These are the most ridiculous moments from the entire Fast and Furious franchise. And first up, we have a moment that involves someone we're never gonna stop missing. The bus scene in Furious 7 gave Paul Walker the perfect send-off. That's not to say that his arc was complete. Walker was one of the core components of the franchise, and it's kind of amazing that they were able to continue after he was gone. Fast and Furious 7 is probably one of the best films we've gotten in the series, and that's all thanks to how it gave Paul Walker the send-off he deserved. The bus scene in question shows him in some dire straits. He's hanging off the bus, which itself is hanging off of the cliff, and he's only able to get out alive because of some well-executed parkour. A lot of the shocking scenes depicted in Fast and Furious involve Brian in some way, shape, or form. I can think of at least one other scene that managed to be simultaneously ridiculous and downright awesome. Brian locks eyes with Mia while driving at absurd speeds. I guess he was serious when he said he wanted to impress her, but the guy might have taken things a bit too far here. Of course, it's all just in the name of entertainment, and I'd imagine that no one would even think of doing this in real life.
You might want to keep your eyes on the road, Playboy.
What, you think we're gonna crash?
I haven't decided yet.
What are you doing, Brian?
This is the kind of scene that could have easily seemed cheesy, but instead, it's just another example of why Brian became one of the most popular characters from the franchise. From racing a car off a pier and landing straight into a conveniently placed yacht from the franchise, he manages to get to speeds of about 80 miles per hour, but he's in complete control the whole time. He even stops at a red light without even having to look up to see it. Talk about skills. Now, Brian isn't the only Fast and Furious character to push the boundaries of reality. Scenes like that are actually the franchise's bread and butter. Dom broke all the laws of physics to save Letty, which kind of seems like his thing at this point. Maybe there's something about being an alpha Chad like Dom that makes you exempt from all the rules, and Dom uses that quite often to save the people he leaves. Just take a look at Fast and Furious 6 and you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a scene in the movie that really stands out. He's chasing after Letty, who happens to be standing on top of a speeding tank. The tank eventually stops all of a sudden, sending Letty flying to what appears to be certain death, only for Dom to step in and do what he does best. He crashes his car and sends himself on a similar trajectory, catching Letty midair and landing safely on the other side. Now, if you think that's crazy, wait till you hear about what Cypher was up to. Zombie cars attacked the Secretary of Defense. Yup, you heard that right. Zombie cars. Although they're not exactly the kind of zombies you'd be used to. Instead, they're cars that have been remotely taken over by Cypher. She uses these cars to corner the Secretary of Defense. I guess all that motorcade money's pretty useless when you're up against an all-powerful hacker. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Cypher eventually orders her cars to start falling off from their high-rise parking lots, and it just ends up raining vehicles left, right, and center. That's when Dom comes in decked out in a suit of armor, which just ends up making the scene even more over the top than it already was. A lot of the characters from Fast and Furious act like they have superpowers, so Dom's actions were pretty much in line with the rules of the franchise. If anything, what he did while fighting Cypher was arguably more realistic than some of the other stuff we've seen. Hobbs has super strength apparently, or maybe he's just way stronger than he looks, which is saying something, because the guy's probably about as jacked as a human being can get. But even so, no matter how much you can bench, being able to stop a helicopter from flying away is just kinda unbelievable. But that's not going to stop Hobbs now, is it? This scene technically didn't appear in any Fast and Furious movies, but it was one of the coolest sequences in the Hobbs and Shaw spin-off, so it definitely counts in my book.
I got you, Hobbs.
Now, you might be wondering what possessed Hobbs to try to face off with a helicopter. Well, he kinda had to reconnect it to the truck he was balancing on. Otherwise, everything would have come crashing down around him. So these past few scenes have been pretty action-packed. But the franchise doesn't need to be all crazy like that to give us some over-the-top goodness. Sometimes all you need is a good old-fashioned drag racing scene, like the scene in Tokyo Drift when we first saw someone drifting. I know what you're thinking. Tokyo Drift is probably the most serious movie in the franchise, and Dom only shows up at the very end for a cameo. But even so, the film lives up to its name thanks to a few cool scenes. The one where they race in the parking lot stands out to me, mostly because it's just not possible to drift in such tight quarters, at least not without crashing and dying. The franchise obviously plays by a different set of rules, so we get to see drivers effortlessly drifting around corners. The only damage to speak of is in the tires. I'd expect they'd get worn down with all that drifting, but of course, while this scene is ridiculous, it's also one of the tamer ones that the franchise has to offer. Why don't we take a look at how all of this silliness began? The original Fast and Furious movie set the tone for the rest of the franchise with this one scene, which is amazing because this movie came out over 2 decades ago. The franchise was a lot more innocent back then. It had way less globe-trotting action and way more underground drag racing. But despite that, Paul Walker came in to give us a scene that I can still remember perfectly. It's the one where Brian and Dom are racing each other and come upon a train track, then play a game of chicken there, waiting to see who'll blink first. And against all odds, they managed to escape the train hurtling towards them. I guess they figured they had to stay alive to do even crazier things in the future. Some of their subsequent ridiculousness didn't even involve cars. The craziest scene in the franchise for me is Dom and Shaw's brawl. Shaw started off as a villain in Furious 7, and him and Don come to blows a bunch of times throughout the movie. But it all comes to a head in the final fight. Dom manages to take Shaw by surprise. He has a shotgun aimed at him, but he wastes his last shell and tosses it aside. And what do you think he pulls out to use as his main weapon? A pair of wrenches. That's right, wrenches. And what does Shaw take out in this fight for his life? He pulls out strips of metal from his car, and the pair get to work, brawling until they can't fight anymore. This scene represents everything I love about the franchise. Does it make sense? Nope. Does it matter? Also nope. Fast and Furious is supposed to be ridiculous. It's supposed to be over the top, and there's no better scene to describe that than this one. That's all from me on the most ridiculous moments in Fast and Furious.